Imagine a weapon that seems too elegant for the battlefield, yet could strip the flesh from bone in a single strike. A tool that appears more suited to livestock than warfare, yet brought empires to their knees. But the world of ancient weaponry holds far more than swords and spears. Hidden in the shadows of history are weapons so unconventional, so brutally effective, that they've been written out of most historical accounts. Consider this: archaeologists have uncovered whip designs embedded with razor-sharp obsidian shards, sharper than modern surgical scalpels, capable of severing limbs with a flick of the wrist. Or whips woven with iron barbs that could rip through leather armor as if it were paper. These weren't tools of discipline. These were instruments of death. Today, we'll uncover 5 of the most devastating whip weapons ever used in combat, each one more shocking than the last. And the first one? It was considered so dangerous that even handling it required years of training. Weapon 1. The urumi, India. Picture a sword that flows like water. The urumi, a blade from southern India that defies everything you think you know about swords. But here's where it gets strange. This wasn't a rigid weapon. It was flexible. A steel whipsword with a blade so thin it could be worn as a belt. Now, you might be thinking, how effective could a flexible sword really be? The answer is terrifying. The urumi typically consisted of 1 to 4 flexible steel blades, each between 4 to 5 feet long, attached to a single handle. When swung, these blades moved with such speed and unpredictability that they created a spinning zone of death around the wielder, a sphere of razor-sharp metal moving at velocities that made blocking nearly impossible. Here's the first satisfaction. Warriors who mastered the urumi were essentially untouchable in close combat. But here's what makes your blood run cold. They could strike from angles that shouldn't exist. Over the shoulder, around shields, behind their own backs. The training for the urumi began with a stick, then progressed to a flexible reed, and only after years, sometimes a decade, would a student touch the actual steel version. Why so long? Because the urumi was as dangerous to its wielder as to the enemy. One miscalculation and you'd slice off your own limbs. In the Kerala martial art of Kalarapayattu, the urumi was considered the final weapon to master, the ultimate test. Students would train blindfolded, relying purely on the feel of the weapon's movement through the air, developing an almost supernatural awareness of its position. But here's what the history books rarely mention. During the resistance against colonial forces in the 17th and 18th centuries, urumi warriors would hide their weapons as belts, appearing unarmed. Then, in the chaos of close-quarters ambush, they'd unfurl these steel ribbons and create absolute carnage in confined spaces where conventional swords were clumsy. The British documented encounters with urumi wielders, describing the weapon as ungentlemanly and impossible to defend against with proper fencing techniques. Translation: their European sword training was useless. One account from 1743 describes a single Kalarapayattu master holding off 7 soldiers in a narrow corridor using 2 urumi simultaneously, 1 in each hand. The blades moved so fast they created what witnesses described as a steel cyclone. All 7 soldiers were found dead. The master had only a single scratch. But the true genius of the urumi wasn't just its lethality, it was the psychological warfare. Imagine facing an opponent whose weapon you can't track. The blade disappears mid-swing, becomes invisible due to speed. Then suddenly you're bleeding from somewhere you didn't even see coming. Some warriors would attach small bells to the handle, creating a chilling sound that preceded every strike, a sound that would haunt soldiers' nightmares. Yet, despite its effectiveness, the urumi eventually faded into obscurity. Why? Because it required too much skill, too much training time, too much dedication. In an age of gunpowder, armies needed soldiers who could be trained in weeks, not decades. But before the urumi disappeared from battlefields, it influenced weapon design across Asia in ways most historians still don't fully understand. Which brings us to a weapon that took the concept even further. Weapon 2, the meteor hammer, China. Now, forget everything you just learned about whip weapons. Because China took the concept and added devastating weight to the equation. The meteor hammer, liuxing chui in Mandarin, sounds poetic. It's anything but. Picture this: 1 or 2 metal weights, each weighing up to 5 pounds, connected to a 12-foot rope or chain. Simple, right? Devastatingly wrong. Here's your next hit of satisfaction. The meteor hammer could build momentum that generated over 2,000 pounds of force per square inch on impact. That's enough to shatter skulls through helmets, cave in chest plates, and break bones even without direct contact. Just the shockwave through armor was enough. But the real question is, how do you control something spinning at those speeds? The answer lies in techniques that seem to violate physics. Skilled practitioners would keep the weapon in constant motion. Figure eights, circles, spirals, never letting it stop. Because once stopped, the weapon was useless. But in motion, it created a defensive sphere that arrows couldn't penetrate and swords couldn't cross. During the Ming Dynasty, military treatises documented meteor hammer techniques with names like Phoenix Returns to Nest and Double Dragon's Chase Pearl. These weren't just flowery names, they were specific tactical patterns. Phoenix Returns to Nest, for instance, was a technique where the warrior would send both weights outward in opposite directions, then snap them back towards center with a wrist rotation, catching an enemy in a devastating pincer strike. Here's where it gets even more interesting. The meteor hammer wasn't just a battlefield weapon. It was an assassin's tool. Historical records from the Song dynasty describe shadow warriors, precursors to what we'd call ninjas, using silk-corded versions that were virtually silent. They'd infiltrate enemy camps at night, the weapon coiled around their torso, invisible under clothing. One documented assassination involved a corrupt magistrate surrounded by 20 guards. A single shadow warrior entered his compound, and within 2 minutes, 12 guards were unconscious or dead, killed with strikes so precise they left no visible wounds except for internal hemorrhaging. The magistrate himself was found dead with a crushed windpipe. The warrior had struck from 15 feet away, wrapped the weight around the target's neck mid-flight, and yanked. But here's the detail that makes your skin crawl. The weapon was found coiled neatly next to the body, arranged in a perfect spiral. A signature. A message. The psychological impact was immense. If someone could kill like this, through guards, through walls, through distance, how do you defend against them? You can't. Paranoia became the weapon's secondary effect. But the meteor hammer had a weakness, and understanding that weakness reveals something crucial about all flexible weapons. The rope or chain could be cut. Seems obvious, right? But here's the twist. Cutting it mid-swing required timing so precise that only master swordsmen could attempt it, and even they often miscalculated. Because the weapon moved in 3 dimensions, constantly changing angles. The moment you committed to a cut, the angle would shift, and suddenly that weighted ball was traveling toward your face at 60 miles per hour. Chinese military strategists eventually developed formation tactics specifically to counter meteor hammer wielders. Tight shield walls with protruding spears, creating barriers that prevented the weapon from building momentum. But in open combat, one-on-one, the meteor hammer was nearly unbeatable. Historians estimate it took 5 to 7 years to achieve basic competency, and another 10 to reach mastery. The weapon required understanding of physics that wouldn't be formally documented until centuries later, concepts of centripetal force, angular momentum, energy transfer. Practitioners learned these principles through muscle memory and feel, not mathematics. Yet, despite its power, the meteor hammer faced the same fate as the urumi, obsolescence. Gunpowder made the years of training impractical. But before it faded, one culture adapted the concept into something even more nightmarish. Weapon 3, the chain whip, multiple cultures. Steel. Articulated. Unstoppable. The chain whip evolved across multiple cultures, China, Mongolia, parts of Central Asia, but the principle remained horrifyingly consistent. Multiple metal segments connected by rings or chains, creating a flexible weapon that hit like a metal bar but moved like a snake. Here's your satisfaction hit. The chain whip could wrap around an opponent's weapon and rip it from their hands with a single twist. But immediately after disarming them, the same motion would bring those steel segments crashing into their skull. Disarm and kill in one fluid movement. The Chinese version, called the Jujibian 9-section whip, consisted of, you guessed it, 9 metal rods connected by rings. Each segment was roughly 10 to 12 inches long, creating a weapon that stretched nearly 6 feet when extended. The last segment often featured a pointed dart or blade. Now here's where the engineering brilliance reveals itself. Each segment could rotate independently. This meant the weapon could change direction mid-flight, curving around shields, wrapping over walls, striking from above even when swung from below. The independent rotation created movements that seemed to defy momentum. During the Yuan dynasty, Mongol cavalry adapted the chain whip for mounted combat. Imagine riding at full gallop while wielding a segmented metal whip. Sounds impossible, right? But the nomadic warriors made it devastating. They'd charge enemy lines, swing the weapon in wide arcs, and the steel segments would impact multiple soldiers in a single pass. Historical accounts describe rows of infantry collapsing as cavalry charged through, the chain whips creating paths of destruction through formations. But before moving on, I'd like to ask you for something. If you enjoy these deep dives into forgotten weapons and want to support this channel, please consider subscribing. It's free. Now, back to the carnage. The true genius of the chain whip wasn't just offense. It was defense. Advanced practitioners could create a steel barrier, spinning the weapon so fast that arrows would be deflected or even shattered on contact. One documented technique called Iron Curtain involved spinning the whip in a continuous figure-8 pattern that created an almost solid wall of moving steel. Here's the dark detail most historians gloss over. Interrogators used specialized versions of the chain whip for torture. Lighter versions with smaller segments could strike repeatedly without killing, inflicting maximum pain while keeping the victim conscious. Records from various dynasties document this use, though most modern museums avoid discussing this application. But in pure combat, the chain whip's most terrifying feature was its reach combined with unpredictability. A spearman has a fixed reach, you know the danger zone. A swordsman has an arc, predictable. But a chain whip wielder? The weapon could suddenly extend 2 feet longer as the segments spread out during a strike, or contract and become compact for close defense. The reach was dynamic, constantly changing, making distance calculation impossible. Masters would use this to create psychological horror. They'd deliberately miss with the first strike, but just barely, letting the opponent feel the wind from the segments passing inches from their face. The second strike would land, but not with full force, just enough to bruise, to hurt. The third strike? That's when they'd aim to kill. It was a game, a demonstration of absolute control. Training regimens were brutal. Students would practice on suspended water-filled clay pots, having to strike them hard enough to make them swing without breaking them, developing precisely controlled power. Only after years of this would they progress to live targets. One famous practitioner, General Qi Jiguang of the Ming Dynasty, wrote that the chain whip was the weapon of surprise, useful for those who wished to confound their enemies' expectations. He documented it as particularly effective against Japanese pirates who raided the Chinese coast, as their katana techniques had no effective counter to the weapon's flexible attacks. But the chain whip had an Achilles heel: heavy armor. Full plate could withstand the strikes, though the impact would still cause internal bruising and broken bones underneath. This limitation pushed weapon designers to develop something even more vicious. Weapon 4, the kpinga, Africa. What happens when you combine a throwing knife with a whip? You get Africa's most feared projectile weapon, one that doesn't just injure, it ruins. The kpinga, used by warriors of the Azande people in Central Africa, looks like it was designed by nightmares. Multiple curved iron blades, typically 3 to 5, jutting out at different angles from a central handle, all wrapped or connected by leather straps or plant fiber cords that allowed for a whipping motion when thrown. Here's where your understanding shifts. This wasn't thrown like a knife. It was thrown with a whipping motion, using a technique that caused the weapon to tumble through the air like a lethal pinwheel. And here's the brutal satisfaction. No matter how it hit, something sharp was making contact. The blades were designed asymmetrically. This wasn't a manufacturing defect, it was intentional. The irregular shape caused the weapon to rotate unpredictably in flight, making it nearly impossible to dodge. You couldn't track its movement because even the thrower didn't know exactly how it would spin. But the true horror of the kpinga reveals itself after impact. The blades were shaped with backward-facing barbs and hooks. Not large obvious ones, subtle, cruel protrusions that caught on flesh and bone. If you tried to pull the weapon out, These barbs would tear devastating exit wounds. Victims often bled out not from the initial strike, but from the damage caused trying to remove the weapon. Azande warriors were trained from childhood in throwing techniques that could send a kpinga up to 50 feet with lethal accuracy. Historical accounts from 19th century explorers describe seeing warriors hit man-sized targets at 30 feet with casual ease, and these weren't stationary targets. They were moving, dodging, and the kpinga still found its mark. Here's a detail that makes ethnographers uncomfortable. The kpinga was also a status symbol. The more elaborate the blade work, the more decorated the handle, the higher the warrior's rank. Wealthy warriors would have kpingas with blades made from meteoric iron. Yes, iron from actual fallen meteors, which was believed to carry divine power. But the weapon served another purpose entirely. The kpinga was used in ritualized combat trials and executions. When disputes arose between villages, champions would face each other in kpinga duels. The rules were strict, 3 throws each, from marked distances. The psychological tension must have been unbearable. Standing still while a multi-bladed projectile tumbled toward you, knowing that dodging was considered dishonorable. Belgian colonizers in the late 1800s documented their terror of the kpinga. Their military reports describe ambushes where warriors would launch volleys of these weapons from concealed positions. Unlike arrows, which followed predictable arcs, the tumbling kpingas seemed to come from impossible angles. Soldiers reported that even when they saw the weapons coming, tracking them was futile. One particularly chilling account from 1893 describes a Belgian patrol being hit by kpinga attacks in dense forest. The weapons would lodge in trees after missing their targets, but their presence created zones of psychological terror. Soldiers couldn't lean against trees, couldn't take cover behind trunks, couldn't rest, because these bladed nightmares were embedded everywhere, a forest of steel thorns. The construction of a kpinga required master smiths working for weeks. Each blade was individually forged, shaped, sharpened, then carefully balanced and attached to create a weapon that would spin correctly. The craftsmanship was so sophisticated that modern metallurgists have analyzed surviving examples and found that the iron was case-hardened, a surface treatment that made the blades incredibly durable while keeping the core flexible enough to withstand impact with bone without shattering. But here's what makes the kpinga particularly fascinating from a weapons evolution standpoint. It represented peak development of throwing weapon design. Every aspect, the multiple blades, the asymmetric shape, the barbed edges, the whipping throw technique, addressed specific tactical problems. How do you hit an evasive target? Multiple blades. How do you ensure maximum damage? Barbs. How do you make blocking difficult? Unpredictable rotation. Yet despite its sophistication, the kpinga disappeared rapidly during the colonial era. Why? Because unlike swords or spears, you couldn't reuse it immediately. Once thrown, you had to retrieve it, and in the age of repeating rifles, that was a death sentence. The weapon's effectiveness relied on a style of warfare that colonization made obsolete. But one culture took the concept of whip weapons in an entirely different direction, one that makes all the others seem almost conventional. Weapon 5. The Scourge, Rome, Medieval Europe. You know this weapon, or you think you do. But the military scourge was nothing like the torture device history classes discuss. The Roman flagellum and its medieval descendant, the military scourge, were battlefield weapons designed to cause mass casualties in tight formations. Multiple leather or chain cords, typically 3 to 7, each tipped with metal weights, barbed hooks, or sharpened lead pieces. Swung in crowds, it was a weapon of chaos. Here's the satisfaction. One swing could injure multiple opponents. The cords would spread during the swing, creating a fan of metal-tipped lashes that could hit 3, 4, 5 people in a single strike. Now here's the horror. Roman legionaries used lighter versions as auxiliary weapons during close-quarters combat in siege situations. Imagine, you're defending a fortress. Enemy soldiers have breached the wall, flooding into the narrow corridors. Swords are too long, ineffective in cramped spaces. But a soldier with a scourge? He swings it in figure eights, and suddenly everyone in a 6-foot radius is bleeding, flinching, breaking formation. Medieval cavalry used extended versions with longer handles and heavier weights. They'd charge into infantry, using the scourge to strike downward into massed formations. Historical accounts describe these attacks as reaping, because the weapons would cut swaths through clusters of soldiers like scythes through wheat. But the psychological warfare aspect was even more effective than the physical damage. The sound. Multiple chains with metal tips spinning through air creates a distinctive, bone-chilling whistle followed by the crack of impact. Soldiers would hear this sound approaching in battle and panic, breaking formation. Because you couldn't block it. Where do you even aim your shield when 5 metal-tipped cords are coming at you from different angles? The Roman gladiatorial fighter known as the retiarius sometimes used a lighter scourge in combination with a net, though this has been largely obscured by Hollywood's focus on the net and trident. But accounts from actual gladiatorial matches describe retiarii using whip scourges to disable opponents' shield arms before deploying the net. Strike the arm holding the shield with the scourge, cause enough pain to drop the shield, then cast the net over the now vulnerable opponent. Yet perhaps the most disturbing use of the scourge was in naval warfare. Pirates and privateers used specialized versions with hooks designed to snag onto rigging and clothing during boarding actions. The tactic was simple but effective. Swing the scourge at enemy sailors during the chaos of boarding. The hooks catch on clothing or equipment, then yank hard, pulling victims overboard or off balance for finishing strikes. The weapon's effectiveness came from its simplicity and the primal fear of being struck from multiple directions simultaneously, a fear deeply embedded in human psychology. We're wired to track single threats. Multiple simultaneous strikes overwhelm our cognitive ability to respond. And that's the terrifying truth about all flexible whip weapons. They exploit fundamental limitations in human reaction time and spatial awareness, making them as psychologically devastating as they were physically lethal. From India's whip swords to Rome's crowd-clearing scourges, these weapons proved that flexibility could be as deadly as any rigid blade, and far more terrifying. If you want more deep dives into history's forgotten arsenals, subscribe and let me know what weapon you want explored next.